Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Create Revenue with a Business of Learning Strategy. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items to assist you with participating in today's event. At any time, you may adjust your audio using your computer volume settings. If you prefer to listen over the phone, you may join by dialing 866-298-8248. The phone number can also be found in the lower left corner of your screen. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the Submit Questions Here pod at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them throughout and during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce our speaker, Julie Stelter. Julie is the Chief Creative Officer for Walden Group and is a lifelong learner who wholeheartedly believes in the transformational power of education. Walden Group is a leader in strategizing, designing, and implementing educational programs for businesses and organizations. At this time, Julie, I'll turn things over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Gary, and Blue Sky for having me, and thank you all for attending. I know you're all very, very busy, and today is Friday. And so my goal today is to make this time you have invested in yourself and your association or organization to be worthwhile and to meet your own learning objectives. In my practice, I have talked with many association professionals dedicated to improving their educational offerings. The number one roadblock I see to their success is a lack of strategy. So I have been researching, practicing, writing, and conducting webinars about this very topic because it is essential to your success. So in the chat box, I would like to know what do you hope to learn today? I've recently read again, as you start typing, that typing in your intentions or typing in notes will improve your learning. But if you really want to improve your learning experience, you need to actually physically write it down somewhere. Just a little tip. Okay, so Eric wants monetization strategies. How to implement. Terry wants how to implement an e-learning program where one does not exist currently. Dan talks about revenue models. And Roberta is strategies for considering new models. Okay, keep typing them in because, like I said, it will improve your own learning. And these are the things. Everything that was mentioned in the chat is what we will be covering today. I want you at the end of this webinar to be able to explain why developing a business of learning strategy is your top priority. And I want you to be able to explain it to your team, your executive director, your president, your board, whomever, so that you can be a leader in developing this strategy. And then I want you to be able to apply the steps to create what I call a business of learning strategy. And the third thing is I want you to be able to incorporate the iterative strategic process while executing your strategy. Desiree, I like your comment about creating a realistic strategy, and we will address that very, very topic. So let's start off. There's two strategic misconceptions that I see associations and other organizations make in their, and what leads their e-learning program astray. The first one is that the strategy is overly dominated by learning goals. And you can see this, an example of this is when associations put on a free monthly webinar and they have no analysis of the true cost of producing the webinar. Does that sound familiar to anyone? I see that a lot when people, when associations develop free, they often forget that there is a cost involved in it, even though you're not generating revenue, and we need to consider that. The other part of this misconception is that the associations might be overly concerned about a business strategy. An example of too much focus on a business strategy is when the first question, and perhaps the only question asked, is how much should we charge? Now, that's not to say that that isn't a valid question, because it is. But it has a place, and it needs to be part of a much, much larger strategy. Okay, so in the chat box, tell me, is your strategy dominated by one or the other? Is it dominated by a learning strategy, or is it dominated by a business strategy? And if so, which one is it? Business, Genevieve says business, learning strategy, business, learning strategy, business. Anyone have both? Anyone think they have a balance? You're free to say that. Okay. So what I'm going to help you now do is determine what makes a strategy a business of learning strategy. You know you have a learning strategy, or you know you have a business strategy, but you need to have a little bit more. Or you need to combine those two strategies into one. Organizations that do this, that I find that the organizations that I work with that combine the learning strategy with the business strategy, is they find that the strategy becomes so intertwined that the business viability and the industry value cannot be separated in their minds. You would not be able, with a business of learning strategy, you would not be able to answer the question, what is your e-learning strategy dominated by learning or business? And that's a good thing. Let me give you some examples. You know that your strategy is dominated by business goals if it answers the question, what are the investment costs? Now, I don't mean just an LMS investment, but also costs such as staff time and expertise and knowledgeable SMEs. A related question, solely focused on learning goals, is what educational programming does the industry want? But if we combine those two goals, we have a much stronger learning strategy, a business of learning strategy, which answers the question, do we have the skill, knowledge, and outreach to support investment in a course the industry wants? Now notice I am using the term industry instead of member. Successful e-learning programs need to think beyond their membership and market to professionals from the entire industry. E-learning programs provide an excellent opportunity for you to rethink and innovate on what it means to be a member of your association. I see Michelle. Hi, Michelle, from Arlington Heights. There is an overabundance of people from Illinois here today, and I'm up the road in Milwaukee. So welcome. Okay, that was a digression. Example 2. A strategy dominated by business goals answers the question, what is the potential monetary return on our investment? What's our ROI? A related question, solely focused on learning goals, is do attendees value the knowledge in the course? Combining these two goals into a business of learning strategy answers the question, can the association generate the non-dues revenue budgeted with the educational program it is designing? Now, if your strategy is dominated by one or the other, I want you to begin to think about how you can include the underrepresented component as we are learning, as we move through this webinar and over the next couple of days. Now, we'll move into the second strategic misconception. This one isn't necessarily solely related to e-learning. This happens in lots of ventures. The second strategic misconception is the belief that the e-learning strategy that is first designed will be the roadmap from the start to the finish, and that plan is linear. Now, does that sound familiar to any of you? That your strategy, it's believed that you'll do step A, step B, step C, and it will ultimately end in a very neat product that will be your vision. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Yes. Let's just dispel that misconception right now. Both at the strategic level and the course development level, there is nothing linear at all about developing and executing an e-learning strategy. There's nothing. And Ashley, I see, Terry, I think you're tongue-in-cheek there. And Ashley, it is very, I see that a lot, that the higher up or the policymakers tend to think that this is a very linear process. But the people that are actually in the trenches don't see it as that. And that's a big problem. And I think that is one of the problems why associations struggle, is just because of the very nature of their governance. And that isn't to kick boards down at the knees, but just because there's a lot of value there. But it's just the nature of how an association is organized. Okay. The fallout, though, from this misconception occurs when goals and numbers and metrics and all of that, they aren't realized. And people start to get upset. And the results of this, indicators that you are part of this or you're experiencing this misconception, is that there can be a lot of blame going around and a lot of finger pointing and or a lot of defensive reaction. The other thing I see quite often is people become so invested in this e-learning program that they start and they see that it's not succeeding at what they thought it would succeed, is put more work at it. And oftentimes there's individuals that are solely being the drivers of the success of an e-learning program. But they're actually they're hiding the amount of work that they actually are doing. And so the success really isn't an accurate success because it's not following the strategy. Associations, this is your pep talk here. Associations developing an e-learning program are embarking on a highly entrepreneurial business program that requires innovative thinking and attitudes. I can't stress this enough. And I find that when I talk to clients and I tell them that they are undergoing something that is very new. I mean, relatively, e-learning is pretty new compared to most of the other things that you do in your association. like plan your annual meeting, for example. I mean, perhaps you've been planning an annual meeting for your association for 7 years or 17 years, some 70 years. Well, there's a lot of knowns in that type of planning. But if you are just starting an e-learning program, you're going to find that there are a lot of unknowns, and you're going to need to be very entrepreneurial. You're going to need to be innovative and entrepreneurial in your thinking, and I want that to empower you. So in the 1990s, two people have come up with something called the discovery-driven planning method, and you can see the references below, and I encourage you to read those two articles from the Harvard Business Review. It gives you a very good sense of this method as an alternative to the more static business plans that a lot of organizations embark on. The discovery-driven planning method is a system that is perfect for new ventures. It's perfect for new ventures because they have, as you have experienced, e-learning programs have a high degree of unknowns as you begin to develop your strategy and as you begin to develop your or execute your strategy. And because of the number of unknowns, there is much that needs to be assumed. An assumption is going to be the key word of the day here, because you have to recognize when you are making assumptions. The discovery-driven planning method occurs in real time. The strategy isn't produced and then you start executing. The strategy is you begin planning, and then you execute a little bit. And then you plan some more, and you execute a little bit more. This method will systematically help your organization determine the value of these assumptions at key checkpoints, and then you will then apply what you learned at that checkpoint to revise your plan. The iterative design method can be visualized with a spiral that represents a fluid plan of testing and revision. You begin by building a reasonable plan that increasingly becomes more specific as assumptions about economics and education are confirmed. The purpose is to maximize your knowledge of the marketplace as quickly and inexpensively as possible. You don't want to take your e-learning course to market and then start testing whether it's going to be viable or not. We need to be doing this in smaller steps. Do we have any questions about the discovery-driven planning method? Before we move forward? Some people are typing. Roberta asks, how does the DDP method correlate with design thinking method? Roberta, that is really an excellent question, and I think that the two are very similar. Very similar. And I think that in order to really answer that question, you have to read more about the discovery-driven planning method and then compare what you know about design thinking method. For those of you who don't don't know what the design thinking method is, Roberta, can you just give us a quick definition in the chat for us, or otherwise, if you're not able to do that, you can just Roberta will look it up. Design thinking method is hot right now, and it has a lot of applicability for e-learning. Thank you, Roberta. So before we dive into the steps of the discovery-driven method, I want to ask you, what is your association's primary motive for creating an e-learning program? Gary, can you start the poll? So your choice, there's two reasons why I'm doing this poll. Well, actually three. One is to keep you engaged. The second one is I'm modeling what you should also be doing when you're developing your e-learning strategy, is to test some assumptions. Given the title of this webinar, I assumed that your primary reason is to generate revenue, and that's why you came to this webinar. That's your primary motivation for developing e-learning program, is to generate revenue. But I want to test that, and luckily I did, because right now 60% of you are saying that you want to build member value. So that's very, very interesting. The third reason why I put this poll up there is because I want you to be aware that there are other really good reasons to build an e-learning program, and one of them is to strengthen reputation of the association. E-learning provides an excellent opportunity for the association to claim its place in professional development, which is an area that is undergoing huge amounts of change. And education can create communities, and very active communities, and very valuable communities. All right, well, thank you. Thanks, Gary. We'll move on to the next, and thank you all for participating. And thank you, Roberta, for giving us a good link for design thinking strategy. All right, let's take a look at how a business of learning strategy can be created, revised, transformed, or even dumped by using an adaptation of the discovery-driven planning method. The first step, and I find the first step to create an educational portfolio and assess technology needs, this is usually done by an association, and they know how to do it, and they know how to do it well. You'll want to put this all in a database and track this information. But here I give you a list of some of the educational offerings that you would want to include in your portfolio. Now, some of you may have some associations have an incredible number of educational offerings. And so the task can be overwhelming. And some associations, there's definitely a finite number. So I was just reading Roberta's design thinking nutshell definition. That's very good. If you become overwhelmed because you just have so much education, then you want to focus on just perhaps one of those educational offerings and begin collecting data. You're going to collect data about the instructional design, which means, is it face-to-face? Is it self-paced e-learning? Is it a recorded webinar? Things like that. You're going to collect data on its popularity. You can compare it if it's an annual meeting You can compare it over a period of every year, or if it's repeated webinars, you can compare it over a period of months. One of the key collection points is your learner demographics, because it's learner behavior that will sell your e-learning. And you will want to use what is already in your association management system, already in your database, but that only includes members, remember, of course, you know that. The learner demographics you will want to be looking at, are we attracting, is this female-oriented, is it male-oriented, is it C-suite, is it entry-level, is it, what kind of titles are we attracting? Are we attracting the target audience, or are we attracting another ancillary audience that we didn't even think about, that this would be valuable to them? You want to be recording and tracking the level of volunteer involvement. Is it high or low, or what range of time are they spending on this? Because that well, even if you're giving them a stipend, that well of volunteer involvement does run dry. So make sure you are tracking that as you develop your e-learning courses. And then, of course, you want to track the topics and whether or not it's associated with a certification or any kind of CEUs. All right, the second step is to define your success. I believe it's Stephen Covey, but somebody in the chat, if you could confirm that with me. I believe he said start with the end in mind. And this is critical to the strategy that we are using. Think back to your motivation for building an e-learning program. And then you're going to answer these questions. What will success look like, given that motivation? How can that be measured? And what is the investment cost needed to obtain the success? In this webinar, we're going to define success as a contribution to non-dues revenue. But you can use this model, this strategy, you can use this model or strategy in any of the motivations that you may have. The important thing here is not to rush the answers to these questions. This is not okay, I'll write a few sentences and then we're done, we'll move on to the next phase of the step. These questions need to include lots of people. It needs to include staff members in all departments. It needs to include stakeholders, staff and other stakeholders from all departments, especially your IT departments, your education departments, and your marketing department. Because success in e-learning programming depends upon those three departments being involved. I'll give you an example of an association I know that implemented an LMS. They went through the whole steps. I shouldn't say implemented. They bought an LMS, and they never once talked or included their IT department in the discussions. Don't make that mistake. You need to include everybody that will be involved in your strategy. Okay. So monetary success will depend upon business of learning strategies. The first one is you need to choose topics the industry needs and people value. This is the learning strategy component. The business strategy component part is you need to develop these e-learning courses, this e-learning program at a cost less than revenue. if you want to make money, if that's your end goal. So let's use a 4-quadrant graph to explain visually the relationship between value and need. If education is to generate, right here in this spot, if education is to generate revenue, the education must have a high need in the industry and be highly valuable to the professional. This is going to be your sweet spot. This is where you want your courses to be. You don't want your courses to be down here. This is where there is low industry need and there is low value by the professionals. Do not develop anything in this spot. In this area here, there is a low industry need because we're on the negative side of things, and the content is high, but the content is highly valued by the professional. When you develop courses with this criteria, you are focusing too much on a learning strategy, hence the books. Now, in the chat box, why might courses in this area be unsuccessful? They have they're regarded highly by individuals in the profession, but there's a low need. So why might courses in this area be unsuccessful? If there's a low need, the revenue will be low. Yes, that's getting toward it. There's a couple people writing. So if there is a low need, if there's a low need but highly valued, okay, Roberta says members can't monetize or justify the course, whether the course is paid for by the member or by the company. And Roberta, that's another really good point. Is if the learning value is if the value is high but the need is low, what happens is that you are that you're focused too much on the learner, and you're not taking in regard that your business needs. And what happens in this area is because there's a high value and low need, that there may be a lot of competition out there. So it may, just because professionals need it, doesn't mean that you necessarily want to offer it, because there may be so many other things out there. But Roberta, your point about monetizing, that is something that we're not going to directly address here in this webinar, but that is something to keep in mind about who is paying for e-learning courses, because that does impact your strategy. Okay. In this area, right in here, where there is a high industry need, yet the content is not valued by the professional, when you develop courses with this characteristic, you are focusing too much on the business strategy. Why might these courses be unsuccessful? And the reason why these courses can be maybe not very successful is because there's not enough interest in the course. And so the opportunity for an association is there, but success here will involve convincing people that the information is important to them, and thus you're moving those courses up into the sweet spot. The opportunity over here is to distinguish yourself from the competition and move that course into your sweet spot. So high need and high value does not mean that you should automatically develop the course. And the reason for that is that it can be a variety of reasons. It can be because it's too much investment, or you don't have that kind of knowledge readily in your association, or as we've discussed, there might be too much competition. We'll come back to this slide in a few minutes. The third step is to benchmark financial metrics and your learning value so that you can begin to answer these two questions. Does the price point match what people are willing to pay for? Does the number of courses needed to sell match the number of people who are willing to buy? Now, you can't possibly answer this question definitively. That's where you need to research, and you need to make an educated guess, hypothesize, and then you need to test this to figure out how realistic your defined success is. Now, I find that associations are pretty good at benchmarking. That's why you see, particularly benchmarking price. That's why you see on the ASAE listserv people asking about how much do they charge for webinars, and do they have a different price for members, and so on like that. Benchmarking is necessary, and you will want to do that. Most of these things listed here we've already talked about when we are documenting your educational portfolio or conducting that internal audit. What's much harder to do and much more subjective is to benchmark the learning value. This is highly subjective, and this is where you're probably going to make your most grand or your grandest of assumptions. And these assumptions you want to make sure you are testing. So you want to look at things like, what is the level of learning? If I'm comparing my association to two other organizations, what is the level of learning that's taking place in those other courses? Would you describe it as, to borrow a social media term, is it a trending topic? Is it an essential topic? Is it solution-oriented, or is it just general knowledge? What level of learning is taking place? Now, clearly, you can see the subjectivity in that. You also need to look at what target audience they're aiming for. And are they collecting other audience members that would not be their target audience? And is there opportunity there? So benchmarking learning value really focuses on what's in it for them. And what's in it for individuals is highly individual, of course. And that's why it's hard to measure. But you're going to give it a try. You're going to hypothesize something, and then you're going to test on how, and whether or not see if your hypothesis has any validity to it. So your fourth step is to document or define all of your operational requirements. You want to be able to document the costs, staff costs. You want to document capacity. This includes volunteer capacity. What skills do you have on staff? What is the knowledge of your SMEs? And then if you see any gaps, what are you going to do about the gaps? Are you going to hire a consultant? Are you going to hire more staff? How are you going to get this work or this skill done? Now, you want to always ask your colleagues to help you, especially those stakeholders who are in the education, technology, and marketing departments. your vision, your strategy must mesh with these department goals in order to find success. Plus, you'll be more accurate about your costs if you involve more people in that decision making. Time and time again, I see it, and this is not just in associations, but this is in corporations, and I often see it more in corporations, is I will be talking with a subject matter expert, a SME, and they'll say, Julie, I had a day job before I started working with you. I mean, overwhelmingly, they will say that. And the reason, this is why you need to start from the beginning and define your operational requirements. Otherwise, people that are taking on the work to execute your e-learning strategy do not have the time in order to put forth to the in order to put success, or in order to build an e-learning program that is successful. So watch out for those kinds of comments. All right. So you're going to make a lot of assumptions about operational requirements. These are a little bit, though, little more concrete than the learning value, so it's a little bit easier to determine. But what I find is people will determine this, or clients will determine this, but then really not acknowledge it and still plan and say, well, we've got to make it work. It's the we got to make it work strategy. So you're going to need to identify the activities that you're going to need to do in order to develop an e-learning program. And then you're going to assign people to those tasks, who's going to do it, and figure out what their capacity is, and if they do it, what are their costs, what is their salary, what is their stipend, what is their fee, and if there's any kind of trade-offs. Now, capacity includes time, the obvious. It includes knowledge and skill, but it also includes buy-in. And let's go back to that person that says, I already had a day job. That person will not necessarily, if they didn't buy into the process, will not necessarily put in the extra work involved in making this e-learning program successful. So you need to be careful of that. Now, we're going back to revisit this slide. In step 4, you estimated the costs involved in developing an e-learning program. And then in the previous step 3, you estimated the price per course and the number of courses you need to sell. If you multiply those two numbers together, you can get your estimated revenue. If your revenue is greater than your costs, then you have generated non-dues revenue. So the revenue will be greater than the cost anywhere in this area here, above the dotted line. And so that here again, here is going to be your sweet spot. Now, we have made a lot of assumptions, both external and internal. What assumptions have we made? We've made business assumptions, such as the price per course. We believe people will pay. We have made assumptions about the number of courses we need to sell. If we need to sell 250 webinars every month, well, then we need to sell that. And if we don't make that number, what's going to happen? How are we going to adjust? We also estimate our staff costs. And here again, this is often underestimated. So we have also We've also made learning assumptions. And what we need to do in order, once you document your assumptions, that's good. I mean, that's really good. But then you also need to have somebody that will look at those assumptions and start tracking them and measuring them. And they'll be like the police officer in charge of it. Like, oh, that assumption is not paying off for us, or is not close enough. We need to adjust that assumption. We need to adjust the plan. You need somebody like that that is intimately involved in the project and can be that the person in charge of tracking. The two most common assumptions that lead to disappointing e-learning program results, excuse me, are that associations. Excuse me, I'm going to take some water. I was telling Gary, the producer, before, I'm in the Midwest. I'm in Wisconsin, and it's crummy weather, and so everything's dry and crummy here. So, okay, thank you. Two most common assumptions are associations make a plan based on assumptions, and they know that it's assumptions. But then over time, these assumptions suddenly become fact. It's just like a switch turns on in their mind, and they think, oh, this is just going to be great when we start rolling in all of these new members and all of this non-dues revenue and so on like that. But then when the plan starts to fail, they think, well, why did it fail? We knew it could work. Well, the reason why it starts to fail, or it starts to show, or it doesn't show the strength that you thought it would, is because the plan was based on erroneous assumptions in the first place. And one of those erroneous assumptions often is from the fact that costs were underestimated. It is expensive. You don't hear too many consultants say this, but I will say it. It is expensive to design and develop high-quality e-learning courses. And if you hear anything different, run. Run and hide. So the indicators that this is happening that you've made these dangerous assumptions is if your deadlines keep moving back, and not by days, but by months. And another indication is that the work effort is increasing. The person who thought they could do this program on 10 hours a week is really working 30 hours a week on it. And the other indication is the budgets simply explode. That's where you know you've made some very serious assumptions that you have not been able to prove, and in fact they're false. When I'm talking with potential clients who think they are ready to design and develop the courses, I'm quietly listening to make sure that they have an e-learning strategy. And if I hear red flags, and sometimes they can be really obvious, like recently I heard this one. Julie, how much staff time is going to be involved in this project? Okay, well that was a red flag to me. And when I hear those obvious red flags, but also more subtle red flags, if I can't convince them to go back to the strategy stage, then I will turn business down, because you simply are not ready to begin designing and developing if you don't have a strong strategy. And everybody is going to be stressed in the process. The sixth and final step is to plan to key checkpoints. Oops. You only want to plan to key checkpoints. So you only implement a couple of items at a time. And the examples of this are obvious pilot programs. That can be a very good way. But other points are, well, let me discuss this with discuss the plan with your industry leaders, perhaps a certification specialist or other associations that have done the same thing, so that they can give you some insight into whether your plan is going to be realistic. The important thing here is to embrace the ability to be swayed by the facts. This will allow you to change your plan and perhaps even your vision, but you have to be willing to change. You can't have anything set in stone. So here are the 6 steps to a viable business of learning strategy. And in all of these steps, you are going to make assumptions, and you need to test those assumptions, and then you need to revise the plan. And even though I have these in 6 steps, it would not necessarily be done in the order that you see here. You may be skipping around a little bit and defining some operational requirements, and then maybe you execute a little bit. So the steps aren't first you do this, then you do this, and then you do this. The steps embrace the fluidity of the plan itself. All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present these ideas to you. I'm going to pass it back to Gary, who's going to answer some of the or present some of the questions that were written in from the audience. So, Gary, do you want to take over?
All
and
right.
If you have other questions, why don't you type them in now so that we can address them before we conclude today.
All right. Thank you, Julie. Now on to the Q&A portion of today's program. As Julie mentioned, you can still submit questions. As a reminder, you can submit questions through the questions pod, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We have a question from Roberta. Julie, do you have any stats or material regarding the overall business value as well as goodwill value of e-learning programs for associations and nonprofits?
I wish I had. There is some, Roberta and everyone else. There are some data. There is some data out there that can address it. But that really leads into the point of today, is that you really have to be doing your own research, because it is, we can look globally at what it's doing for associations or what e-learning is doing in corporations. We can look at that, but individual behavior, because the product that you're putting out is so individualized to the very person that the best research is going to be the research that you actually conduct yourself. And I know that you wish you had better, but you have to build in that research component as part of your strategy and as an ongoing management of your e-learning program, because of the highly individualized value of that learning is.
All right, we don't have any other questions at this time, so again, thank you, Julie. On behalf of Blue Sky eLearn and Julie Stelter of Walden Group, I would like to thank you, our audience, for your participation in today's event. If you had a question and didn't get the chance to ask it, you may contact your project manager or email it to path@blueskyelearn.com. You may also contact Julie. You will now be directed to complete your post-event activities for CAE credit. Webinars are an important part of our programming, and your feedback is vital to the improvements and developments of future events. Please take a few minutes to complete the post-event activities to receive your certificate. You will also receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. Again, on behalf of Blue Sky eLearn and our presenter, we thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.